Welcome to the Community Climate Hub Fall Webinar Series. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Community Climate Hub Initiative. My name is Mikaleen Khan, Regional Organizer for Ontario. Through several trainings a year, including Denver, Seattle, and Pittsburgh just a couple weeks ago, which Victoria also attended, Climate Reality trains leaders to share the urgency of and solutions to climate change. We're also helping create community climate hubs throughout the country that will help raise the bar on climate action in Canadian cities while spurring ambition at the provincial and federal levels. This webinar is part of our fall series, which you can see listed on your screen. Sign up for the upcoming webinars at climatehub.ca. These webinars are meant to exchange best practices and tools that you can leverage in your own cities to accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. Today's webinar features Victoria Serda, co-founder at StepFour Consulting. Victoria has worked extensively with Saugeen First Nation and Anishinaabe community located at the base of the Bruce Peninsula since time immemorial. Since her teenage years, Victoria has championed rural action on climate change as a public speaker and grassroots organizer, later as an organic farmer, then as an elected municipal councillor. She has the honor of being one of the first 20 Canadian climate leaders trained by Mr. Gore in 2007. After having run millions in programs with Indigenous and settler governments, nonprofits, and companies, she now has her own consulting corporation, StepFour, that specializes in implementing community dreams. The floor is yours, Victoria.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, everybody. I'm going to share my screen now and we'll get going on my presentation. There we go. So the presentation today is about how to have respectful relations with our Indigenous communities and in part why we want to do that. I mean, most of us, I think that it would be on this call would understand that there's definitely a benefit with working together with a lot of diverse groups, but it's really particularly good for us in Canada to be able to have an opportunity to work with Indigenous communities and in fact around the world. But I'll be talking specifically about what's going on kind of in Canada, in Ontario, to give us that unique benefits. So welcome, Ani, Shimo Panole. I'm saying the welcome in English. Ani is in Anishinaabe, which is the language that's spoken on the traditional territory of the Saugeen Nation that I currently am on. I acknowledge their territory. And Shima Padnote is actually welcome in the language of my daughter and my husband, who's Indigenous to Texas. So I'm just sharing with you here a little overview about what we're going to be doing, just so you have some idea of where we're going to be going and the things that we're going to be talking about. There is a two-page handout that's being provided to all the participants. It has notes on it that all of you will be able to use to keep track of what's going on. So you can feel free to either just participate and watch and listen, or you can take notes in addition to what will be provided to you as well. And just a little bit about me. In the top was I actually helped organize a unity walk in support of the Dakota Access Pipeline here in Saugeen First Nation. And it was a reconciliation project between Saugeen Shores and Saugeen First Nation as well, which are two local neighboring communities. And I live in Saugeen Shores and the reserve is right next door. And I live on the wonderful Lake Huron at the base of the Saugeen Peninsula, or it's often called the Bruce Peninsula. So I live 8 blocks from a sandy beach. And I put together this collage just from the picture in the top left is when I got the training with Al Gore back in 2007. I look a little younger, so does he. He doesn't have quite as much white hair there. And then I put a bunch of pictures from this most recent training in Pittsburgh, where we had over 1,400 people were trained, and we had a wonderful time with the Canadian groups and with so many wonderful people from around the world. And I had the honor of being able to be on stage and talk about what it is to be a mentor and a climate leader, especially since it was my 7th time mentoring at one of these trainings. And in particular, being able to bring up Indigenous relations and why it's important to be able to work together. So I'd like to acknowledge the help of 2 elders that helped me with the base of this presentation, Ningwakwe George, who was trained by Mr. Gore in 2015 in Toronto, and Shirley John, who is a water carrier from Saugeen First Nation. She carries the teachings around water. So she's somebody that I like to be able to talk with and talk about environmental concerns. Both of them went to residential schools, and Ningwakwe says that she calls herself a thriver, not a survivor. So she believes that there's been a lot of healing and things to work through, but all of the trauma and abuse that they suffered at residential schools, they're very forgiving and really want to be able to work with people to be able to help make the relations better, and also so that we can learn from each other. So the benefits of working together are that they have a very rich culture. It's very rewarding to be able to work with them because there's more of a need for people that can establish trust and have a good relationship. But I also believe that as settlers to this area, that when people first came from, in this area, it was mainly from Europe, the Anishinaabe people around here and all across Canada and the world, like in North America, they often helped the people be able to settle and have food for the winter, and they taught them how to be able to deal with things. And I think that we have a responsibility in order to help as well and promote that healing because of the intergenerational trauma that they have from how horribly they've been treated, just to be frank, from the government. I want to mention that the Indigenous worldview is a little bit different than more of a European kind of culture. They have a very strong belief that water is life, that Mother Earth is us and we are our mother, and that we should protect the earth in the same way that we would protect our own mother and that we would protect babies. They also see things as being very interconnected. And so I put this beautiful art from Niall Johnston on here, he's a band member from Anishinaabe, and just kind of demonstrating that the way that they think has a lot more to do with connections. And this particular graphic here has to do with we had an Affirming Our Identity community meeting, and a series of things where we were talking with people about who they thought they were and what they really cared about in their community. And this was the graphic that came out of that, that kind of showed all the things that were very important to them. But you can see that the way that they see things are different than if you were doing this in a different community. They're much more connected. They have a clan system where people have different responsibilities depending on which clan they're in, and they take their responsibility very seriously to those things. So when we're going into a community and an Indigenous community or working with Indigenous members, one of the biggest things that's important is to establish trust. One thing I do when I go to the reserve quite often, and I attend their events just as a regular person, where I act as an equal and as a friend and ally. We're all on the same footing. They see things more in a circular kind of fashion. And I keep a really open mind to make sure that I'm not kind of imposing my solutions onto what I think should be happening. We have to listen first and then suggest things that could work or not, and make sure that they're able to say the things that work for them. When you first meet people and you're trying to establish the trust, the feeling that they get is really, really important. That first impression is the biggest thing that you can do. And just being authentic and also very gentle is really important, because a lot of them have gone through a lot of trauma, and we have to be really careful about triggering them into basically a post-traumatic stress kind of situation for themselves. That because we sometimes the way that people have done things with them has been very difficult, and we need to be gentle in how we're going about it. So the importance of building a relationship is so that we can be more effective in being able to really partner and be clear around kind of what we want to do, where we're coming from, the things that we may think, and being aware of that the whole time when we're talking with people, and understanding that when you're having a partnership with any kind of group, it's always better when everyone is on equal footing and equal participants, and really they have a community buy-in together to what's happening. And we also need to figure out what the funding priorities are for them with what they think is most important in their own community. We have to make sure that when you're building this, that you put things together. In this picture, there's 3 climate leaders all together. Brandy Farr is on the left, and Ningwakwe George is in the middle, and I'm on the right. We are going down to a climate event in Waterloo around Indigenous relations. And, we have to keep it light and happy, make sure that everyone is agreeing to things, that you're really clear about who you are, and that we listen as well as clarifying when we know that there's going to be things going forward or actions that we want different people to take. So parts of effective communication have to do with being really persistent. So if somebody doesn't answer, sometimes it can be actually that there's another priority that's in their community and or in their work or their life that we may not know. They're very interconnected, especially if you're, dealing with people that are on a reserve. A lot of them are related to each other, and so an illness or a passing can affect a lot of people. It's important to see the good in the situations and the strengths of what we're doing and what they have and the people they have already, and build out of those strengths. Finding the best contact method for each person that we deal with is really important because everyone uses different things. I find that a lot of people that I deal with, Facebook messaging is one of the best ways to deal, because they may not always have a phone, they may not always have a computer at home, but normally they have someone that they check Facebook for, so that they're able to, be able to see photos and kind of keep up on things and with their own families. So being able to check in periodically is also really, really helpful, just to make sure that they're doing all right as human beings, and also just to kind of see how things are going in a project. I also give a lot of updates on the things that I'm working on, and make sure that I always get approvals for the next phase of the things that I think would probably be good to do. I try to be very cognizant that that for some of them, English is their second language. So for the reserve that I work with a lot at Saugeen First Nation, there still are people that are fluent in Anishinaabe, and that's still their primary language. Luckily, they're trying really hard to be able to keep that. But we also have to speak at thinking about the literacy level of the people that we're talking to. A lot of times we do our communications at about a grade 5 level, just to make sure that everyone is able to understand that. It's good practice in general, but in particular on reserves, when they may not have finished as much schooling as some other places, it's good to make sure that the language is very plain and clear and easily understood, so that there aren't misunderstandings or mistrust that develops. Sometimes having issues, like there can be issues with mental health or other kinds of considerations when you're dealing with situations with people. And you have to make sure that their perspective is being considered, and that they may have different priorities in their life to what we may think. So for instance, they call it being on Indian time sometimes, where you go to a meeting and someone will show up half an hour later because there was an issue with their child, and they may not tell you ahead of time that they're going to be late. But I just try to be a little more flexible and relaxed with those types of things. And it sometimes is harder to be able to do future planning because of they have so many factors in their lives that they're trying to figure out how to deal with. So when you're wanting to go and have a meeting with them, one of the things people ask you is how do you do that first approach, and how do you try to figure out what you're doing? So one of the things that's really important is to try to match whoever you're meeting with. So on the screen here, I have a picture of Jerry. He's from Nicaragua, and he's meeting with Vern Root, who was the Grand Chief of the Anishinaabe Nation, but at the time he was not just, but he was the chief of Saugeen First Nation, and you can see that they're dressed in a similar way, and that helps them to feel comfortable with each other when they're meeting. And we need to do that when we're meeting with anyone, but in particular with Indigenous people. It's good to find out, what their normal culture is around it, what their local language is, what types of things that they are already doing, listen to the things that they're working on, and talk about the things that they would like to do. If we have other ideas, then we openly discuss them and put them on the table so that they can then be able to have input and say whether they think it would work or not, and then help us to be able to have a really good solution moving forward. If you're having subsequent meetings, it's really important to make sure that there's an invitation, that there's a community champion, that there's a full agreement on what you're planning to do or what is going to be happening that is clear for people to understand. This photo is from when we were organizing having an electric vehicle charging station. And the priorities may be different for them. And sometimes people are very shy. So you have to be I understand that might be the reason why they're not answering as much, and just try different ways of communicating. So in each area, they have a different kind of responsibility to their local area and region. So one concept that I've found is really useful to understand is that they really believe in mutual benefit. So if you want to go and talk to them and you're non-Indigenous and you talk to an Indigenous person, they want to make sure that it's good for you and for them. So it's good to be able to say what you're getting out of something if you're going to talk to them, and what they will get out of it when they're talking to you. It's good to have that right on the board. It's also important to make sure that whatever formal approvals are needed are done in well ahead of time, whatever stage you're at. Because the band councils have a very strong fiduciary responsibility to their communities in the same way that local municipality, local municipal councillors do. And they're very careful about their due diligence and risk management when they're looking at different partnerships or projects that they'd like to do. But they have a stronger sense of community. And so when they make decisions, they tend to want to make sure that it's the best thing for all of their people. And they often engage with all the different age groups of people when they're trying to make a decision. So they involve elders and youth as well as adults and the whole way around within their community. They also see resources like in a different way. Like all of the resources we have around us include water and air and land, and they also see money as being a type of resource. And they really care a lot about their health of their extended family, and they have quite a few different priorities around doing things, but environmental protection is one of the big priorities that they have in their own daily lives as well as just in the community. So if we want to move on to talking about legal agreements, internationally, there are some things that when you're working with Indigenous communities, it's good to be aware of. So the United Nations did have a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that one, if you're not familiar with it, is really important to take a gander over. And then I've also listed off the Aquacon, now I'm not saying this one's a Haudenosaunee word, but a Takari Wainri, which I know some of my friends like Renee and others that speak that language. I'm probably messing it up, but in the Nagoya Protocol, there's specific protocols and agreements at an international level that talk about Indigenous communities needing to be part of the discussions on things that affect them. And in particular, they often talk about free, prior, and informed consent. So it means that they need to have a free, open discussion about something. They need to do it ahead of time before a decision has to be made. And then they actually need to agree to it at the time. So in Canada, in the provinces, there's a switch that's happening right now around, there used to be what they called a duty to consult, where it meant that somebody had to go and talk with the Indigenous communities that would be affected or that it was their traditional territory. But that was misused a lot because if they would consider it consulting if they went and talked to one person that was a band member, and then that person's opinion was counted as being from the whole group. Whereas free, prior, and informed consent is a much bigger process, and where you're educating the whole community, and there's usually something like a referendum and vote at the end of it for people to be able to formally consent to a project or something going forward. It also falls under, in Ontario, under the Human Rights Code, and actually Indigenous spiritual practices are lined out within that code as something that needs to be accommodated. So it's good for people when they're dealing with Indigenous communities in Ontario to have a good understanding of that as well. We also need to understand that over many hundreds of years, they have given agreement to certain treaties and exchange wampum belts and things like that. But the governments have been very tricky. Like John A. Macdonald actually had a strategy to take the Indian out of the child. So they had very direct things that were very detrimental. I've been told by elders about how they had they saw their grandparents have their sacred objects taken away from them. They weren't allowed to hold their ceremonies in public, and they had curfews imposed on them for what times they could be there. The Indian agent had to give people approval to leave the reserve. There were a lot of controls that we weren't taught about when we were in school. And we need to understand that those things have a big effect on why they're not able to establish trust and have relationships in the same way. But even the spin and the way that things are talked about in the same way are still a serious issue. For instance, on the right, I put up a thing for an article. I actually helped with this project with bringing the treaties to Owen Sound that were the two of the treaties that related to this region. But these treaties were disputed because they weren't done actually with all the community members. They were only with a few community members that signed on behalf of everyone else without their approval. So these treaties are in the courts being disputed. Whereas the reporter from the Sun-Times put a title, "Land Surrender Treaties Honored," which sounds like it means that they are actually saying that the treaties were good when that's not their position. So we need to be really careful about the language we use around these things and make sure that what we're doing is actually appropriate and correct with the situation when we're talking about it. You'll notice at the start, I recognize that I'm on the land of the Anishinaabe people that are from this region. It's Saugeen Ojibwe Nation territory. And it's a respectful thing to do when you go somewhere to make sure that is recognized, because they have a very unique presence. And my friend Joy Parr is a professor, and one of the things that she studied is having a very strong sense of place, where people, when they live in an area, they get to know it really well and they really understand everything about that environment, and they have a different perspective than people who have moved there. And so that is really important as part of that respect, but also because they are able to assert their rights when they're doing that. So with Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, they have this as an example. They have got the federal environment minister to be able to say that the deep geological repository that's being proposed from the nuclear facilities around here has to have their consent. So we can have them as partners and good helpers when we're trying to be able to do work that's on climate change, because they actually have a lot of rights that are enshrined at the international and federal level to be able to support the type of work where we are protecting the environment. I know I'm getting a little further on in time, so I'll try to get through these last few slides here with you. So we have the cultural and spiritual responsibility is a little different than how it's often seen in other cultures. So water is something that's very, very important. You've probably seen the water is life signs everywhere. And they see it all as being interconnected, and that we need to be looking after the land, air, and water, and our spiritual lives as well, for us to all be in balance with each other. One part of that is Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, and it's something that we can also draw on if we are partnering with them. Because although they may not have the scientific wording, they have a lot of experience, and they can actually quite often really be able to read what's going on in the world around us, and be able to tell us about what's happening in the winter and how climate change is affecting us, how the water will be fluctuating, that there are a lot of seasonal changes, and they have direct experience that they can bring back from all of those stories that they have from 10,000 years of those traditions being passed along, in order to be able to help us really understand what's happening. If you're looking at funding for First Nations communities or for Indigenous groups, there are two new ministers that are dealing with this at the national level. And provincially, there's a Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. So they have their own separate pots of money. But each of the bands also have their own revenue sources. Sometimes they have regional distribution, like Casino Rama distributes money out to the bands that are part of their agreement. They also receive funding from different corporations, charities, or foundations that are able to be accessed. And sometimes those funding sources are just for them, and sometimes they're for partnerships. So developing those types of partnerships is really good too. So just a couple tips on that one. It's really important to have a community champion. I did a lot of work with Brad Ritchie, who's in this photo, and he's the Economic Development Officer for Saugeen First Nation. See what's available and what they really need to be able to do, what they have time for, and make sure that that mutual benefit is talked about. One thing that's really helpful is because they don't always have the Western language for being able to deal with things, helping them to write grants and applications makes it a lot easier. Like, this was one application, this was what they sent back, with 10 different attachments of forms and stuff they had to fill out, which can sometimes be a lot for anyone to look at. But if you're able to help with that, it's really really helps move things along. And it's also a benefit, and value that we can add in. And also for all of us, any kind of partnership helps the funding people to be able to have more credibility in partnerships. So we want to be able to do that as we keep going on, to have stronger and stronger partnerships. So the projects these are just examples of different projects that I've worked on them. Also, a lot of the pictures that I've been showing up till now have also been of different projects that I've worked on. But they love working on community gardens, tree planting, sustainable building, energy planning. A lot of those things where we're looking at the future and trying to make them to make things work out well are really good. And environmental remediation is something I've done a lot of work with them on, as well as bringing their workers out into my community in order to be able to participate with that. These are a few local things that we're working on. So I actually just got my new T-shirt today for the showing of an Inconvenient Truth that we're doing this weekend. We're starting up a community climate hub in both Saugeen Shores and Saugeen First Nation. And I've got my model, my dad, Ken Pace, who's been helping me poster today. Down on the bottom there, we're working on it locally, and Brandy Farr and Karina Serda are going to be helping me at this weekend as climate leaders at the event as well. They've been helping along, but they're also doing that too. So just to wrap up, this quote from Chief Joseph is a really good one, I think, for kind of saying why we should be trying to be able to help and support First Nations and Indigenous communities and members with being able to move things, because we really need to build these kinds of relationships for all of our collective futures to be better. And they're like-minded partners that I think we're underutilizing in Canada. And if we work together more with all of our projects, that we would all be able to get a lot more done together. So miigwech, that means thank you in Anishinaabe. I'm grateful for your time in listening to me today. And I'll turn it back over to the Climate Reality Project Canada, and we'll have more of discussions shortly.
Thank you very much, Victoria, for that informative presentation. I think I speak on behalf of most people in this webinar when I say that whenever I speak to somebody who has close ties to Indigenous communities, I do come out of it having learned a lot. So that said, I would like to acknowledge that where Matt and I are calling in from, our Montreal office is actually located on traditional and unceded territory of the Mohawk community. And just a little reminder to participants right now, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Victoria, please feel free to use our Q&A tab. That should be located in the chat panel of the Zoom application. I'd like to, before we get into that Q&A, just give you a little rundown of where hubs are going and a little briefing about them. Okay, so sorry, before I get into that, there's also a poll that that I'd like to share with you right now and ask you to participate in. And if you can see it, the first question reads, have you worked with Indigenous communities in the past? That's the only question, actually. So if you could just answer that, I would be very grateful. That goes into our database so we can better learn how to equip Canadian hubs. Okay, so we are currently in our second phase of hubs across Canada. And that involves onboarding a couple of extra cities, as Victoria already spoke about, municipalities across Canada from the original 6 that were initiated in May earlier this year. And ultimately what we want to do is have these municipalities move along a 5 milestone framework that seeks to measure municipalities' emissions, set reduction targets, draft plans to meet those targets, and implement those plans to monitor progress. These are all steps that we see municipalities very capable of doing. So hubs are in the forefront of helping municipalities achieve these goals, all through a local, citizen-based and diverse background. So on top of that, we invite you to explore the Climate Hub website. It's full of resources that we've borrowed from external organizations as well as developed ourselves. You have the Truth in 10 presentation available from Mr. Gore, as well as links to future webinars and upcoming events. This year, we're trying to make sure that municipalities track their emissions through a series of metrics that will be available to hubs very soon. And we're already trying to mobilize hubs to collect data on those metrics, and with the hope of releasing a first report on that data by April of next year. And these can go anywhere from governance to building bylaws, as you see in the list below. So for example, if we take transportation, how can we make sure that municipalities are encouraging the uptake of public transit? How can we make sure that they're building more bike lanes and encouraging active transportation? We'd really like to see hubs push for the encouragement of these metrics to be accomplished by their municipalities and ultimately achieve significant emissions reductions. So the first question that we have is from our Zoom invitation that we sent out a while ago, and it's quite broad. Victoria, if you could just speak a little about some of the challenges and opportunities that you see for green building solutions that includes residential, non-residential, and how perhaps Indigenous values and practices could play into these solutions.
In Saugeen First Nation, they've had an elder who works for a long time in the green building field. So we actually there was an elders facility that was built to the LEED standard, and it has geothermal, and a lot of it is built with wood. It has in-floor heating, a lot of really nice green features into it, and even it was funny because Mark Salerno, who's a climate leader who's trained by Mr. Gore in 2008, he actually works for CMHC and came up in order to help with the announcement of them, completing it and having a celebration around it. And so we've had some of the people that have been in the green building world have come, to visit Saugeen First Nation to see what they've done with that elders facility. So there's quite a few things that are going on already in their communities where they're trying really hard to be able to get off of fossil fuels and have it's also an economic thing for them where they're trying to reduce their operational costs for people so that their electrical and energy bills aren't so high. So working a lot of times with green building ideas, they understand the need for it. It depends on the community on whether they have the technical expertise themselves to be able to do it or not. But there are groups within the Indigenous communities that have the expertise that it would be good to be able to partner and find somebody that's familiar with the local people that you want to be able to work with that can kind of be a mediator between the worlds and be able to talk about these things between everyone. If that makes sense, hopefully.
Yeah, and speaking to becoming familiar with your community, Lisa Kohler wanted to ask, what is the most respectful way to engage your local leaders? And how do you determine who is the best elder to reach out to discuss local climate action?
My strategy is always to just keep asking people. So if you can develop a relationship with one person that's good, where you trust that you're coming from a good place and you have a good heart, and then ask them to tell you who the best person is and ask them to do a warm introduction for you to that person. And if that person doesn't feel they're the right person, ask them to find the right person for you. So they almost always want to be very helpful. And when you're coming to them with the right space and the right heart. So it's kind of a process of asking questions of people in order to find the best person for what you're needing. But I've sometimes, even with knowing most of the elders at Saugeen First Nation personally, sometimes I'll go to one elder and ask them something that I think is related to what they would be doing normally, or with their expertise and the knowledge that they're carrying in the community, and they will refer me to a different elder to discuss the same topic with. So you just kind of have to just keep asking questions and doing that in a gentle, respectful kind of approach.
So I don't know if all the participants in this webinar can see, but we're going to announce the results of the poll you just did, hopefully. And so
I will be soon. That's a great one.
There you go. So half of us have engaged and worked with Indigenous communities in the past, which is, I don't know if you can draw a general statistic, Victoria, about this kind of response, but this seems quite high, right? I would imagine the average is lower for most Canadians.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. It's a good sign that people that are really care about climate change and want to act on it are involving their Indigenous communities in it. But if there's anybody on that list that hasn't done it before, or they're going to be doing it soon and they'd like to have, you know, further conversations about this, just let me know. I'm around to be able to just chat with people and help with some advice on these types of things. So I'm really easy to find. I have an unusual last name.
Fantastic. And I do believe that your contact information is shared in the webinar series. So that's fantastic. I'll leave it to Micheline to close up and wrap up for today.
Before we do that, do we have time? There's one more question that is on the Q&A panel.
Oh, sorry, I hadn't seen that.
So is it okay if I answer that one?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because the question is around the how to make sure that we're being sensitive with the way that we're wording when we're talking with First Nations or going to their land. The best thing, what I do every time when I go somewhere is before, especially if I'm going to be doing public speaking or having a spokesperson kind of role, is I ask someone in the community first, what's the respectful way to do it? So every community has a different way that they like the language to be for, say, for the acknowledgement of the territory or how you're going to participate. So like once I did a climate change presentation up on Manitoulin Island, and I asked them how to be able to do it. So they actually gave me the wording and, you know, and told me exactly how to pronounce it and how to be able to say everything. And then I was able, when I got up and did the welcome and the speech, I was able to acknowledge the territory in the way they wanted and welcome people to it in a way that was respectful. And it wasn't sounding like I was welcoming them to my territory because it wasn't my territory, right? So it's good to just find, if you can develop a trusting relationship with one person who understands the diplomacy and the culture, then you can go to them and just keep asking these kinds of questions. And if they don't know the answer, they'll either find out for you or they'll refer you to someone else who does know, because they really want people to be able to talk and work together. So it's just, again, just a process of just keep asking the questions of people. And if you can do it ahead of time so that you don't make a mistake, then that's even better. You're very forgiving of mistakes, though. It's like, has a lot to do with your intent. If you're a nice person and they can feel that and that you're just going to be helpful or supportive, then they'll forgive you if you make a little bit of a faux pas. Well, I think we're done with the questions, so that's good.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for everybody for being with us, especially Victoria. We hope that you've all come away with the knowledge and inspiration to get active in your community, and we invite you to sign up to join a hub at climatehub.ca. Our next English webinar is on Tuesday, November 14th at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and will feature Alan D'Souza, the Mayor of Saint Laurent, a Montreal borough that's the first sub-municipal jurisdiction in Canada to have completed a greenhouse gas inventory and to have adopted a cultural plan to complement their greenhouse gas reduction strategies. So you can sign up on that same website, climatehub.ca. Thanks again and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.